So one of my goals in inviting moderators was to invite people who have and I don't who've been around town long enough to appreciate that administrations vary, the players in administrations vary, and I was particularly pleased that Ruth Marcus agreed to take a break from her column covering the presidential campaign, which is certainly one of the more interesting ones in my career, because I think one can get lost when one talks about the CEA. It's a great mind meld between nerdy economic journalists who actually care about the second revision of GDP more than Dick Morris's behavior, and the economists. But actually, the goal of this is not good economics. The goal of this is good public policy. So Ruth is joined up here with Catherine Abraham, who was a former member of the CEA in the Obama administration, Marty Feldstein, who was chairman in the Reagan administration, Martin Bailey, who was chairman in the Clinton administration, and Randy Krasner, who was a member of the CEA in the Bush administration. Ruth?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I have to confess to, I think it's a little bit of a journalistic case of the bends, which is I've been in Iowa and New Hampshire pretty solidly for the last 3 weeks. And I would like to say this is a pretty good crowd, and especially if there's an overflow room, it's a pretty good crowd for like a town hall in Nashua. So that's good, but to have this kind of highfalutin discussion of the CEA and to have just experienced 3 weeks worth of stump speeches on the campaign trail and questions that may be more like, when are you going to start deporting the illegal immigrants, or when do I start getting my larger Social Security check? I'm having a little bit of cognitive dissonance here, and I'm very, very pleased to be at least temporarily back in the world of people who think seriously about policy. As I was coming over here, I was trying to think about the President Trump or the President Sanders or the President whoever's CEA, and I was wondering, of these presidential candidates, I think I got to maybe 4 that I could think of who even could tell you what the CEA was, no less sort of what role they imagined the CEA would play in their administration. So it will be an interesting campaign going forward. I wanted to start historically, and we want to talk about the role that the CEA can play both in developing good policy and preventing bad policy. And I was struck in that excellent chapter about the history of the CEA with a story that Martin Feldstein talked about, where I'll let him tell the whole story, but he joined forces with David Stockman to do something that does not necessarily come naturally to Republican administrations. And I think I'll let you tell the story from there.
Well, thanks very much. Well, the story that I told in my little box in this chapter is that when the tax cuts were enacted in the beginning of the Reagan administration, we had expected that the bracket creep that would produce more revenue. Remember, tax brackets weren't indexed until 1986, and the inflation rate at the beginning of the administration was about 10%. So the expectation was that rising inflation and rising incomes would push people into higher brackets, would produce substantially more tax revenue, and that would offset the tax cuts that had been enacted. Well, Paul Volcker not only did a great job, he did a much bigger and better and faster job than anybody expected, so that by 1983, the inflation rate had come down from 10% to less than 4%. And while that was great news for the economy, it was terrible news for the revenue, because without an offset, we had a larger deficit than we had expected. And so it wasn't dramatically larger, but it was substantially larger. Some of the deficit, to make things more confusing, some of the deficit we experienced at the time was because we were coming out of an economic downturn But there was still a structural deficit, and that took some convincing to convince other members of the administration that this was a problem. And Dave Stockman, who was then the head of the Office of Management and Budget, and I worked on trying to persuade the president and the members of the administration that something had to be done about this and that we had to raise taxes. And so I think that's what you had in mind.
But how did you go about doing that? What was your kind of theory of how to get the president clearly to do something that was not in his instinctive desires?
Well, I mean, the president had two different kinds of instinctive desires. One was to bring down tax rates, and he had succeeded in doing that in some sense more than he had anticipated, because what he had proposed originally was sort of met and raised by the Congress. They did more on the business tax cuts, on depreciation changes, than the president had originally anticipated. And so there'd already been a little pullback. It was supposed to be 10, 10, 10, 10% tax cuts in a row, and we modified the third 10% to 5%, but that still left us with a structural deficit. When I say the president had different goals, one of his goals, which he had talked about for many years before he ran for president, when he was out speaking about economic issues, was low deficits. So he was an anti-deficit guy as well as a low tax rate guy. And Dave Stockman and I reminded him of where he was on that issue and that required some changes. And his reaction to it was each year that I was there, in each budget, there were tax increases. There were tax increases, but there were tax increases on business rather than on individuals. And there was some loophole closing. I don't remember the details. But one of the things the press enjoyed was that I would testify or I would give a talk and I would say, and so we have to deal with this deficit by reducing spending and raising taxes. And then there would be a clip of Marty saying, and raising taxes, and there'd be a clip of the president saying, I will never raise taxes on hardworking Americans struggling to make ends meet. And that was true, and he didn't. But he also did raise taxes each year to shrink that fiscal deficit.
Maybe we should go in chronological order, and Martin, you can tell us about your incredible policy triumph, or preferably your moment where you couldn't stop bad policy.
Okay. Well, the incredible triumph, of course, is that the economic growth during the Clinton years was really stellar, and I did commiserate with Alan Kruger a few times because we would go marching in and say, another 300,000 jobs, growth is, 3%, 4% or more. It's funny because when I first went to CEA, I asked a number of senior economists what kinds of things we should focus on. And they said, well, productivity's been so slow, and you've studied productivity. The CEA has a good chance. You've got to think about policies to increase productivity growth. And I thought, well, what on earth am I really going to say when it comes down to it, or what can the president do? But lo and behold, by 1996, productivity growth was booming. So I'm not sure what we did, but boy, it worked out really well.
Well,
You took full credit for it.
Yeah.
And in fairness, I do think the policy environment, certainly not me, but the policy environment that was created was conducive to productivity growth. So I think there should be some credit there. A policy failure. Well, I'll tell a story about that.
Good.
We had a lot of careful processes around anything to do with trade and free trade agreements and stuff like that. So there was all these long, often boring NEC meetings where we talk about the free trade. I think CEA did a good job, by the way, in making sure the numbers were better than the ones we would get other places, let's say. Let me put it tactfully that way. But we did have one interesting experience, which was that I got into the White House 7:30 meeting, and Sandy Berger was a little riled up. Well, it turned out that President Clinton, who had been at an APEC meeting, had gone to play golf with Lee Kuan Yew and some of his senior people. And while on the golf course, Lee Kuan Yew had said, it would be really great if we had a free trade agreement between Singapore and the United States. And apparently, President Clinton said, yeah, that does sound great. We should have one of those. And so, of course, Singapore immediately announced that we were going to have a free trade agreement between the United States and Singapore. And so Sandy had been woken up in the middle of the night or at some early hour because the U.S. ambassador to Chile had called him. Of course, Chile had been trying for years to get a negotiation on a free trade agreement, hadn't really succeeded. And Sandy said he heard more expletives in such a short time on that phone call than he'd ever heard in his life. And I reflected that having worked with not only the president, but with John Podesta and folks like that, that must have been a pretty high bar that he had then.
So the key to preventing bad policy is keep your principal off the golf course.
Keep your principal off the golf. Well, he is the elected official. I mean, we do have to remember that, and we're serving at his pleasure, not the other way around. I think, quite honestly, it all's well that ends well, because Chile managed to get its free trade agreement when Singapore got its free trade agreement, which was signed by George W. Bush. But we missed out a little bit on the process on that one.
So, Randy, we've talked a little bit in previous panels and comments about whether CEA is better at pulling weeds or planting seeds. So I don't know if you want to talk about pulling weeds or planting seeds, but talk about what it was like for you to do either one of those tasks, or try to.
Sure, I'll try to mention a little bit of both. I'll start off with the negative. As Austin had mentioned, there are a lot more economists than there used to be. And so it's great when all the economists agree across all the different agencies, but it's not always so great when they don't agree. And one of the challenges we had was an international issue of how to deal with Argentina. So this was 2001. Argentina was in a little bit of trouble. Some countries may be experiencing some similar troubles now. And there were very strongly different views in different parts of the administration. Now, some were more State Department views, which were geopolitical views. There were different issues that came in, but there were differences between the Treasury and the CEA on this. The CEA was basically the only agency that thought that perhaps the support for a second bailout for Argentina was not going to work, and we stood our ground. We voted against, but we knew we'd be outnumbered. But I remember when I left the CEA a few years later, most everyone sitting around those tables still worrying about Argentina said, well, maybe we should have listened to you 2 years ago. So I think if the economists don't agree, then it's a real problem because other considerations can take precedence. On the positive side, getting back to the positive side, thinking about crises, which is where I think CEA can be particularly helpful, because you can have a framework. And so, although I think it was Alan who said that, the laws of economics go out the window. The laws don't go out the window. The applications may be very, very different. But we still have a framework for thinking about demand curves sloping down. So after 9/11, there were a lot of people who just didn't know what to do. The political situation was completely different. The defense situation was different. But we had a framework for trying to think through problems and just use sort of like basic cost-benefit analysis. I think Alan's exactly right. The cost-benefits may change dramatically in a crisis, but it's still a framework for thinking through those kinds of things. I think a second thing that's also very helpful is to know history. So whether it was when I was at the Fed, more recently, or at the Council of Economic Advisors, knowing how you respond to extreme events and what can work and what what doesn't, I think is extremely beneficial. And so one of the issues we faced is, should there be a government backstop for terrorism risk insurance? So the first issue was, should the government be involved in this issue at all? Well, the government got involved in insurance back in the 1930s in deposit insurance. And obviously that is still with us today. We at CEA thought it made sense because there was a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know whether new buildings would be built or not. We didn't know whether chemical plants would be built or would have to shut down, or storage facilities would have to be shut down. We're getting a lot of information in that things could go terribly wrong. We had a lot of difficulty being able to determine whether that was true or not. Were we willing to take the risk? And so we decided, well, we don't think we should take the risk, but we also don't think the government should be the only supplier of this. So let's do it so it's shared risk between the government and the private sector. Try to structure it as a temporary program to see whether the private sector can provide it or not. And I think the most important thing was that we said, well, let's try to increase the amount of risk sharing by the private sector each year during the it was a three-year temporary program, so that you could gather more data. You'd be able to see, well, is the private sector able to handle it? Is it not? Is this causing increasing problems? Because part of this was from the history of deposit insurance. People forget now that deposit insurance was a temporary program that's temporarily been with us for 80 or 90 years. Now it looks like the terrorism risk insurance may be with us. It's been renewed multiple times, but at least it still has a limited horizon. We thought about the incentives associated with it. We thought about gathering data. We tried to look in the longer run. And also it was very helpful by doing it this way that it gave us something to negotiate with in Congress. So those who wanted more or those who wanted less could negotiate the particulars of whether it was 5% in the first year, 10% in the second year, 15% in the third year. For us at CEA, the specifics didn't matter. It was just the idea that it should be working towards a phase out, and so that was also very helpful in getting things to work.
I'm sorry. Did you just say that you actually managed to create good policy working with Congress?
And
if so, we should just conclude the panel now and go celebrate.
Well, first, some people would disagree that the government shouldn't have been involved in the backstop at all. So I think that I think we did the right thing at the time because of the uncertainty. I think we were able to structure a policy to try to get out, but the policy is still with us, and they don't have that same sort of phase out in it.
I just wanted to react to your comment about what seemed like the impossibility of negotiating with Congress and accomplishing something. I have to remind myself that during the 8 years that Ronald Reagan was president, the Democrats always had an overwhelming majority in the House. So he always had to negotiate, and yet we got a tremendous tax bill in '86. We got a Social Security reform that Alan Greenspan was critical in. We got the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement. So the notion that you cannot get bipartisan agreements, at least in those years, and I can imagine going forward it should also be possible. So I don't rule that out.
Yeah, but Marty, to nitpick with you, he was able to put together a coalition often with Southern Democrats and Republicans. I think it was a somewhat different time. Not to say we shouldn't try to be bipartisan, but I think it's tougher today.
I think it was that Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill, and the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors sat down and had a drink together. Was my story of how bipartisanship happened. Catherine, please answer the question that I would ask if I could speak.
Well, that really leaves me open to talk about whatever I want to talk about, which is great.
We talk.
Which
Now,
I'm going to do anyway.
You lost your chance. Sorry. We talked about having more than one economist in the room, and it strikes me in particular if you think about the 70 years of the CEA. I've only been around for some of them, and you have had more economists in more places. You have a National Economic Council that you didn't have when I first came to town that really seems to kind of, to me, change the balance of power a little bit inside the White House, and the maybe, I don't know quite how it alters the role of CEA, but I'd be interested in your reflections on that as you reflect on policy achievements via CEA and maybe policy, if not failures, less than perfections?
Well, let me try to reflect on that.
Looks like it's on.
It is actually on, but maybe I need to pull it closer. So one of the things that's true about the CEA that's been noted already is that most of the people who come to the CEA come out of academia. They come for a couple years and then they go back. That's not true of everyone, but most of the people who come. And it's interacting in that environment is so different than anything any of us are used to. In academia, if you write a good paper, people will read it and you'll get reaction to it. And so it's just the quality of the work and the quality of the argument that's being evaluated. I've spent time elsewhere in government. I was for 8 years at the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a very hierarchical organization. And so if you came into a position in that organization, of course you were going to be listened to within your realm of authority. The CEA is not like that. This sort of gets to the question that you were asking. Within the White House, there's all these people with all of these different interests. There's people who come into the White House who are activists, and they're there because they have a set of issues that they care about, and they really want to push policy forward on those issues. There's the people at the NEC. So one of the issues that I experienced with respect to CEA and CEA's ability to influence policy was just getting to the table. That sounds sort of it's maybe surprising, but there's a set of issues where clearly if there are meetings going on and people discussing things, CEA will be invited. But there's a lot of issues where economists have important things to say that people don't necessarily think to turn to the CEA.
So give us an example of that.
Oh, education policy is an issue where economists actually have a lot to say, but it's not necessarily a given that the CEA is going to be invited to the meetings where decisions about that are being made. Immigration is another issue where economists have a lot to say, but there's another whole other set of people in the administration who think that that's their policy.
And so in the internal bureaucracy, how do you manage getting the seat at the table?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that are really important. One, of course, is the relationship that the chair develops with the president, and if it's seen that the chair has a strong relationship with the president, then the CEA members and staff are going to be at the table. So that's one thing. The other thing that I came to appreciate, and I'm looking at you, Nan Gibson, was the role of the chief of staff. So the chief of staff of the CEA plays an extremely important role in getting to know the corresponding people in all of the other parts of the White House and making sure that if there's a meeting being held on some topic that CEA cares about, that the CEA is there. So that's another thing. And then I guess the third thing is something that other people have touched on. It's being a good team player when you get to the table. That doesn't mean agreeing with people. It means bringing relevant evidence to the table about the topic under consideration. It means that if somebody's proposing a policy that you think is really bad to get to a goal, a bad way to get to a goal, coming up with other ideas about better ways to try to get to that goal.
So this raises the question that I want to get to, which is about the sort of odd duck that is the CEA. You've talked about the importance of being a team player, but there's also been talk about the sort of nonpartisan nature of CEA and people coming in and out of academia and not necessarily working for the administration that they thought they were going to be working for. So I guess I have my first question, I want to throw it open to everybody to chime in, is how does CEA sort of both be effective in getting that seat at the table while managing, and so being perceived as a team player, while managing that tension, especially in a world in which there's competing economic voices that are much more on the team, while managing the tension of maintaining its reputation for, I guess what we'll call in this town, some degree of objectivity and not being totally partisan. I'm trying to say this in a way that's not going to get me in trouble with any CEA chairs in the room.
Well, one way you become a team player is by sitting next to Rahm Emanuel at White House meetings. And if he doesn't like what you said, he starts punching you on the arm, and you better. He's obviously changed his ways, I realize, but I think one way is not by lecturing. I think for example, I'm a supporter of trade expansion. That's not something that everybody in an administration is necessarily going to support as well. So I think just to go into meetings endlessly and repeat the free trade mantra is something that doesn't win you any friends and doesn't get you there. Charlie Schultz, when I first went to the council, said that the secret of the council is that you have to find out what you think is the right economics and then try to persuade people it's the right politics. And I don't think I was probably anywhere near as good as Charlie was at that, or as some other CEA chairs. But you do have to realize what can your audience hear, and how can you push the debate in the right direction, I think, and that's as far as you're able to go.
Anybody else want to weigh in there?
Just
Catherine?
to add in to that, I mean, in any context, the CEA can provide evidence. So if you're talking about, for example, changes to the tax code, temporary tax credits or tax cuts to encourage job creation, the CEA can do an analysis about what way of doing that might be best, and you can present that. But you have to accept that at the end of the day, that may not, the policy that looks best from a cost-benefit analysis may not be the politically most acceptable policy, and may not end up being what ends up happening. I'm thinking, almost I think any economist in the room, if you were talking about, how you would structure tax cuts to encourage more hiring, you probably wouldn't favor an across-the-board cut on employer taxes. You would probably favor marginal tax cuts that rewarded employers who hired more people. But you can lay that out, but if that's not where it's going to go, you stop there.
Marty?
I would distinguish different kinds of policies, and I think this is like the issue of planting and weeding. Being the originator of a policy and selling it to your colleagues, that is a super hard thing to do, because what is the goal of policymakers? To have their policy accepted. So not invented here is the critical thing. And no matter how good the policy is that you bring to the table, if it's somebody else's, if you're competing with somebody else's chosen policy, you have a much harder time. So that's why I think we're probably better at shooting things down, at weeding, than at planting new things. I think the question of how do the economists, both the chairman and the members and the staff, get a seat at the table? At least in the Reagan administration, it was pretty structured. So there was a cabinet council for this and a cabinet council for that, so that if the issue was a human resources one, well, there was a cabinet council that dealt with that. And so any education policy would be handled at that level and would move up from staff to sub-cabinet to, if necessary, if it couldn't be solved at that lower level. And then the third thing I would comment on is that, as you said, there were lots of economists. We didn't have, when I was there, we didn't have the NEC, but of course, every department had a senior economist. But their job, they had, as I said in the little piece in this publication, they had two jobs. One was to come to meetings and try to push forward good policy. The other was to represent their department. And there's a kind of schizophrenia in that. And of course, I didn't know what they said behind closed doors to the secretary in their department, but when they came, the spending departments in particular, when they came to cabinet council meetings, I suspected that they weren't telling us what they deep down inside as professional economists believed. And so in that sense, the CEA, which didn't have that kind of departmental loyalty, but really only had a loyalty to the president and to quote good economics, I think that gave us an advantage in winning arguments because the people who were on the losing side of those arguments didn't hold those views as strongly.
I want to open it up to questions, but I sort of want to leave a thought that might permeate the questions about whether that commitment to good economics that CEA has been able to embody, kind of its survivability in an age of increasing partisanship. And I guess I'm in a particularly cynical mode, having come from the campaign trail. But I want to kind of leave that as a lingering question, even as we open it to others.
Actually, I just want to add something in from a great line that Mike Musa, who had been a member of the Council of Economic Advisors and who was a mentor of mine as well as a mentor of David Wessel's, on exactly this point. He would always say that in Washington, truth is just another special interest and one that is not very well financed.
Well, in the back there, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. You can dispel a myth and then comment on how the CEA might have played this out. The myth is whether or not, who was the last president who had a balanced budget? And I'm thinking that it was actually Richard Nixon, and the point of, or whatever question it was. But the point of my question is, to what degree the CEA historically has factored in deficit spending for recent wars. There's a sense that both Iraq 1, Iraq 2, and then Afghanistan were basically deficit funded. And they led to an increase in the deficit. So I'm wondering if it may be a myth, so I'm saying dispel it. But to the extent that recent wars have been debt financed, how does that play out in the economist's analysis at your level?
Let's try to get in a few questions, and maybe we can answer them as a whole. Another question on that side of the room right there.
How would you advocate policy today in the presidential campaign? How would you, for example, advocate growth? What growth policies, particularly what role public investment might play?
So maybe we can twin those questions: deficit-financed wars, campaign policies promoting growth. Anybody on either of those?
So on deficit financing or debt financing of wars, this is another area where history can be very helpful. As we were just talking about, another one of my mentors, who's at Harvard, Robert Barrow, has looked at the history of financing of wars, and he would argue that it's optimal to do that rather than to raise taxes very significantly in the short run. If your survivability is on the under question, what you want to do is sort of issue debt, and if you think you are going to be able to survive, then you repay it rather than have the negative incentives of the high taxes in the short run. And so that has been a long history of that, going back hundreds of years.
The first Iraq War cost exactly zero. It was financed by our allies.
Okay.
I'm not going to comment on the deficit financing of the wars. I have my own views about those wars, but I'm not going to speak as an economist on those. So on the issue that's being raised about the current campaign, and you raised this earlier, I do think there's a failure, whether, I don't know, not a failure of CEA, I don't know if it's a failure of economists, I don't know if it's a broader failure of the society. I think it's probably all of those.
It's probably the press.
It's all of those. Now, stay with me. The thing that we didn't do, and was true even in the good years of the Clinton growth, was that the growth was much disproportionate. So even in the best years, the folks at the bottom made a little bit of progress. In bad years or in recessions, those people have gone down. And so I think we're reaping that whirlwind in the sense of this election, because the folks are not doing very well, and they've either moved to the left or to the right, and we're seeing that in the election that you've been covering. What do we do about that? I think I don't have a good answer, and this is probably not the right place to be trying to answer that. But clearly we need to be exploring some different policies that have been tried in the past in order to try to deal with that and the political fallout that's happening because of that.
Another question, Alice.
Alice Rivlin, Brookings. This conversation has illustrated that economic policy is very fragmented in our government, and lots of governments have a finance minister who not only does finance, but he does budget, and he does the equivalent of the CEA. And when we're represented in foreign meetings, we take a whole bunch of people, and there's one finance minister across the table. Is this an advantage or a disadvantage in your experience?
So one of the treats of being CEA chair is I traveled around and I had a chance to meet finance ministers, and most of them were very articulate, very smart, very experienced, and didn't understand economics. So given an economics question, they could give a very detailed, analytic answer, but when you got to the very end, they got it wrong. And they probably had a staff economist who worked for them, but who was invisible. And so I think our system is really quite remarkable in that we put a senior economist who reports directly to the president and who is seen visibly both internationally at meetings and also by the Congress, by the public. I think that's really a great advantage of our system.
I'd just comment that other countries are getting CEAs. I know Germany has one. I know some other countries are doing it. So I don't think we may have started out as a unique institution, but I don't think we're quite as unique now.
To me, it seems there's a lot of questions where there's considerable disagreement among economists. And I think one advantage of our current structure is that it forces those involved to really debate back and forth on what the evidence shows before moving forward on a decision, and I think that's a positive. It's in keeping with our general approach to government and wanting checks and balances and so on.
One of the remarkable things that the CEA has done is to train large numbers of senior economists about economic policy. There's no better school for learning about the real issues and thinking about how the policy process works, but also understanding many of the technical issues involved than spending a couple of years in Washington at the CEA.
Right, let's, right here.
I'd like to reframe that first question about financing war, because I thought that the person that asked it was asking something different. The issue, I thought, was not whether you finance it by deficit or by raising taxes, but in the case of some of those wars, whether it was on budget or off budget. And my sense is that, and certainly this would have been the way when I was at the council, our analyses would go behind that veil. The council would not. I mean, it was politically expedient to treat the thing as off budget, but in doing the analysis of what the impact on the economy would be, we would just treat it as though it was the same as anything else. Am I wrong? I mean,
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the question was. I thought it was about the form of finance.
When you are dealing with programs that are treated in different ways in the budget, and you're trying to analyze their economic effects.
For sure. The budget has nothing to do with economic reality.
Right.
I think we can all agree on that. Yeah. And so
that's the quote of the day.
Right, yeah.
And the CEA would try to see through that, for sure.
And in the case of the financing the wars one way or the other, the issue was what was shown in the budget document versus what wasn't shown in the document.
Yes, woman right behind you. Right here, you. Yep.
Hi. I'd like to just follow up on that question that Alice raised. Do you think that in the three examples of crises that have been raised here, whether the advisors came together, she mentioned the fragmentation, but to what extent do you think that there was a synthesis that really addressed the crises that you were faced with?
Well, we should have had the previous panel who had more difficult crises than we had. I think when, towards the end of the Clinton administration, where the equity market was gotten higher than was sustainable, and there was a potential there and a potential for a downturn of the economy, I think there was a lot of meeting of the minds among the people in the economic team in terms of talking to the president about that.
Anybody else, or we can go on to additional question? Yes, this woman right here, and then on the side of the room.
Marina Whitman at the University of Michigan. One of the peculiar characteristics of the current campaign, and I think this is true on with respect to both parties, that the comments from candidates that seem to be resonating the most with the American people at the moment, it makes both evidence and expertise look like negatives. And if this persists, how would a CEA function in that kind of environment?
With difficulty, I think, with great difficulty. Hopefully, when whoever gets to be president will have a slightly different view of it. But I think you are raising something in our body politic, which is mistrust of evidence. And to plug some of my colleagues here at Brookings, there's a lot of effort in trying to get evidence-based policies. So let's hope that is successful.
And I guess I would just observe, as disconcerting and disappointing as this campaign is to cover from somebody who used to spend hours on the phones with campaign advisors talking about economic policy and the intricacies of how much various health plans were going to cost and things like that. Maria Cuomo talked about campaigning in poetry and governing in prose. I think now we're campaigning maybe in excess and bombast, but we still have to govern in prose and budgets and reality. So it's hard to imagine an actual governing White House being as unsubstantive as the campaign to get there is.
President
And
Trump, you're fired, right?
Yeah. No matter who is elected. Thank you guys so much for a really interesting panel.